What's going on, Draft Junkies? Chris Bengel here. I'm joined by my co-host Ryan Struve, and welcome to the BackDraft podcast, where we dive into draft classes of the past in the NFL and NBA. With the intro episode out of the way, this is episode number 1, and we're going to dive into the 2017 NFL Draft, which was a very interesting one. Some big star power going at the top of the draft, and a lot of mediocrity in between. So we're going to dive into kind of what the 2017 draft brought. Like I said, very interesting one. The 2017 draft took place in Philadelphia, and I myself actually attended the 2017 NFL draft. I went to night 2, and it was definitely a fun experience. You got to see the Super Bowl or the Lombardi Trophy on display. Each team's Super Bowl rings from the past were there, so that was kind of a cool thing for fans to experience. And the crowning highlight of that day and maybe the weekend, as far as crazy Philly fans are concerned, is Cowboys legend Drew Pearson comes up to announce the Cowboys' second round pick and got booed into oblivion. Ultimate troll job, and it was a lot of fun to watch that. And Philly versus Dallas is the ultimate rivalry, so seeing him get the business was absolutely hilarious. And
So
joining
I've never attended a draft, Chris. And this is your co-host Ryan. Is that a big money grab by the NFL? Are they charging $20 for beers and packing people in?
they're definitely packing them in. I don't know if it's still this way because that's the only time I've ever gone. But if you want to get in, like there's a seated area, you have to win tickets. I believe they're free, but you have to enter a lottery, and obviously really hard to get picked because they're only picking. I don't know what the amount is, but I would say it's probably maybe 1,000 people, something like that. It's not a ton. And then you can kind of stand behind that, which is what I did. Um, I I don't even remember what the concessions really were. I know it was by the Philadelphia Art Museum, so kind of near the Fairmount Park area. For those that are familiar with Philadelphia, I actually just went to a restaurant beforehand and got food because I figured it would be kind of insane. I don't remember the pricing, but I'm sure it was quite the money grab because it's the NFL.
Yeah, this is the first draft that was held outdoors, actually, which I think was a really good move on the NFL's part to try and include more fans instead of having 20,000 fans in an auditorium or what have
Right.
you in New
It was
York.
always the Radio City, I think, for the most part. I don't
Yeah,
know.
which is probably not even
No.
20,000. It's probably
Yeah,
5,000
that's
fans or something.
not a huge venue, but
They had like 250,000 people there, which is crazy.
no, I think moving it outdoors, I think, was definitely the right move. I mean, we've seen it in Detroit, Chicago, like all these iconic football cities, and then this coming year going to be in Pittsburgh. That's going to be a lot of fun. Obviously, we have an interest from that standpoint, being a Steelers and Eagles family. That's going to be fun to see those fans taking the draft, and I think that's going to be absolutely packed. So that'll be interesting this year.
Yeah, Pittsburgh always travels well to other stadiums, and I'm sure they're going to pack their own as well
Oh,
for the draft. Before we hop into the 2017 draft, looking at some of the hot news in the NFL, we don't need to break down box scores or anything, but what do you make of this Jamar Chase, Jalen Ramsey situation?
I don't know why this happens so frequently. I mean, this is what the second or third time this has happened this year. Happened with Jalen Carter earlier in the year at an Eagles Cowboys game. Carter ends up getting tossed after not even the first play from scrimmage, and then it happens this past weekend. Jamar Chase gets into it, Jalen Ramsey, and with the amount of video that's out there now, like you have these 4K cameras and everything in between, like there's everything everywhere. You can't say that you didn't do it when it was blatantly seen that Jamar Chase clearly spit in Ramsey's face, and then Ramsey punches him, gets tossed. Probably a fair reaction. I would say most players are probably going to react that same way, and you know, but then after the game, Chase up and down denies it, and once the video kind of came out, there was there's no reason to keep denying it. You did what you did. He gets a 1 game suspension, which he plans to appeal. It sounds like, and I'm assuming it's probably going to be upheld. But I don't know why we're doing this, and in this day and age, like, why do you have to? I feel like it's so disrespectful to spit on somebody. Like, if you're gonna, shove somebody, whatever, like grab them by the face mask, what have you, like, not a big deal. But I feel like it's extremely disrespectful to spit in someone's face, and it just happens way too often.
Yeah, my interest in this is one. Players always respond by hitting the other one in the helmet, which I always find an interesting decision.
Absolutely
Given that they're
ridiculous.
wearing, a helmet that's designed to withstand another helmet hitting it,
Yeah, what
they would
damage
use
are you
their open
doing?
hand to try to hit them. If I were in that circumstance, I would think I would be motivated. If I were going to respond physically at all, I would hope that I wouldn't. But if I was, I'd try to rip their helmet off their head. Like I would grab the face mask and try to rip it off their head.
And then if
Um,
you're going to take a swing, fine. But
and then from Jamar Chase's standpoint, it, what's the deal with spitting on people? Like I'm 40. I just turned 46 years old this past weekend, and I have a decent memory of my life, and I can't remember a single time in my entire life when I've been motivated and thought to myself, I should really spit on this person because I'm so mad at them. Um, Physical violence as a child or what have you, or yelling or what, like I can
sure.
understand those emotions, but where's the motivation to spit on somebody, Chris?
I don't understand. It really boggles my mind. These are the guys playing the most like macho sport in the world, and your first thought is when you're getting into it with somebody, hey, I'm going to spit on this guy. Like that's really going to send a message. Like, just why are we doing that? I don't think I've ever had the inclination to do that to another human either, but clearly, it happens. What happened? I feel like the most notorious one was Bill Romanowski.
Sure.
Was it late '90s, early 2000s? On JJ Stokes. That was a. I feel like that's the most iconic one I can remember. And even any time in history, like, why do we need to do this? I will never understand it.
Yeah, the motivation just doesn't make sense to me, especially when you're losing the game, which I believe the Bengals were at the time when
Yeah,
Jamar decided
they
to
definitely were
spin.
because
It was
that
pretty
was
late in the game, right?
yeah, it was early fourth quarter. I want to say late third quarter, something like that. I mean, it was definitely you know Steelers had a fairly decent lead at that point, and then it kind of got off the rails from there.
Yeah.
But again, just makes no sense, never will, and I don't get it.
Other piece of NFL discussion. He didn't play this past weekend because he had a bye, but Jonathan Taylor has just been on an absolute monster tear this entire season. I think he's got 3 touchdown games. I don't know how many total touchdowns he has now,
That's what I was
20 or
just gonna look
something.
up.
Um,
Okay.
if Jonathan Taylor continues on this run and scores another 3 or 4 3 touchdown games, and the Colts go on to go 13-4 or something and win their division, do you see any route to Jonathan Taylor getting any MVP votes at the end of the year?
I think there's, like I said, it's going back to it. You always look at it. It always seems to be a quarterback award, which obviously quarterback the most important position in the sport. Not surprising that those guys always get the bulk of the votes, and traditionally, you know that's where the award is won. 2012 was the last time that a running back has won the award when Adrian Peterson won it. And then before that was we saw in 2005 and 2006 Sean Alexander and LaDainian Tomlinson winning it back-to-back years. But it's super rare. It's always a quarterback award. But I think with Taylor, I mean, the run that he's been on is absolutely insane. Having the multiple three TD games, and obviously, if anybody has him in fantasy, I don't know if anybody on this podcast does, but they've been pretty happy with his performance. I would say
Yeah,
this year.
yeah.
He
Chris and
is
I are in a friends and family league, and I've got Jonathan Taylor, and have been
clearly the
enjoying that.
best pick of the draft, without question. But he's the way he's having these multi touchdown games and just ripping off these ridiculous runs. If he can get maybe even just another two touchdown game or two, and keep these piling on the yardage tallies, I think there's a chance he'll get some votes. I think you'll get some people that writers may vote for him. Um, I still think it's such a hard award to win for a running back, for anyone but a quarterback, really. At the moment, I think Drake May, I think, is the odds-on leader at the moment, having a big year for the Patriots. Um, so I definitely think there's a chance, but it's definitely an uphill battle for him to actually win the award. He would have to go, I think, even more nuclear in the rest of the season to in order to win the award.
Yeah, I mean, Saquon Barkley had an historic season last year. 2,000 yards. He didn't have as many touchdowns as Taylor's scoring, but he got some votes. He got 0 first place votes though. He did get some second and third place votes and finished third in the MVP voting. So I would assume Taylor would get
Yeah,
some
I think
number of votes.
keeps up this pace. I don't think I'd be hard pressed to think that at least a couple voters wouldn't vote his way. And I mean that's a good point with Saquon. He, you know, nearly beat Eric Dickerson's record. If he plays that, doesn't sit out the final game, he probably breaks it. And even still, doesn't get any first place votes. And I think that's really all you need to know. Taylor's probably not winning the award, unless he goes, has 3 5 touchdown games or something absolutely crazy. I think otherwise you're not going to see him get more than a couple votes, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you would need a situation where the Patriots fell off significantly and
Right.
there was like no clear front runner on the quarterback side. Um, but anyway, I think that's an interesting story, interesting to think about,
Absolutely.
given that he's had seasons like this in the past. I mean, this is better than his previous best season, but he's sort of come back to sort of crush it.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't see it. I think Drake May would have to fall off. I think Josh Allen potentially an outside chance if he ramped it up in the final weeks, and but I think it does look like it's May's award to lose at this point, especially if they finish strong. And I don't think their schedule's overwhelmingly difficult. So, like I said, Taylor probably isn't going to get there, but it's still, historically, it just doesn't happen very often. So, it is cool to kind of dive into that and see, you know, how few times that a running back has won it.
Yeah, we went through this a little bit last year with Myles Garrett. I remember he was having just an insane season defensively last year. And I can't remember if he got injured or kind of tailed off towards the end of the season and ultimately didn't end up getting any votes. But there was some chatter in the middle of that season that maybe he should win the MVP. Obviously, the difference is that the Browns were terrible last year. And
Yeah,
so
if the Browns were, ever.
hard to win the MVP on a losing team.
No. And even still, I mean, you put Miles Garrett on, I don't know, the Eagles or the Bills or something, like even stand a better chance if he has that kind of historic season, like if he got to 20 sacks or something like that. But I mean, seeing a defensive player win that award is just, it's even crazier than a running back. It just likely isn't going to happen.
Sure. All right, so if we jump into the 2017 draft, I don't know if you want to set the scene for us, Chris. What was the vibe heading into this 2017 draft?
Yeah, I think this is one of the years where we kind of knew who the number one pick was probably going to be. Miles Garrett was, ironically, we were just talking about, was an amazing star at Texas A&M. Kind of was heralded as the quote unquote number one pick. There really wasn't anyone after that that was probably going to go in that spot. So leading throughout the process, Garrett was the guy, and was viewed as the guy that the Browns were probably going to take in that spot. Um, I think that you know it wasn't a huge surprise. Sometimes you have the lead up to the draft. In the days leading up to it, you just don't know who's going to go number one. Whether a team needs a quarterback, whether they're going to trade down. But I think in this spot with the Browns needing that defensive help, they weren't going to trade out of that spot, and were more than happy to take Garrett. And obviously, all these years later, still is a force in Cleveland. 117 and a half career sacks, which is the fourth most among active players. He's, only behind Von Miller, Cam Jordan, um, some of those guys that have been doing it for a minute. And he is as dominant as it gets. And, I think the number one pick, that's really all you can ask for as far as what he's done.
Why do you think the Browns didn't go with a quarterback in that at the top of that draft? Like they obviously needed a lot of help, and their quarterback the previous year was Cody Kessler.
That's a blast from the past.
Right, exactly.
Um,
Who isn't exactly great. They had Terrell Pryor on their team as well at the time, who was a sort of quasi quarterback. I'm surprised that they didn't at least shoot at one of these quarterbacks.
yeah, I mean, it seemed like for the most part, this quarterback class wasn't super intriguing. I mean, obviously there was one big name which we'll get to later that ended up saving the class, but the Browns ultimately do pass on getting a quarterback and then end up with Deshaun Kaiser in the second round, I believe it was,
Yeah,
and was basically continued the trend of the Browns drafting atrocious quarterbacks. The list is probably one of the more noteworthy ones that teams have had. You had Tim Couch back in the year Donovan McNabb was drafted, Brandon Whedon, like I said,
there's a
Kessler.
great
They had.
list, a great image somewhere. There's a fan of Cleveland that has a jersey and puts the name of all their starting quarterbacks on the back of the jersey, and it's like
Oh, I think
almost
I have
filled
seen that.
now, where they run through all of these just terrible quarterbacks that the Browns have had over the years. I don't know exactly how far back it goes, but yeah, all these guys are on there.
I mean, they haven't. I mean, the only one that was probably worth anything was Baker Mayfield, and obviously also not there anymore, and kind of fizzled out in Cleveland, and then has had success, going elsewhere to the Bucks. But besides that, like the list is just absolutely terrible. I don't probably hard pressed to find a team that has drafted the quarterback more terrible than the Browns have
Yeah,
over the years. But
totally agree. Who
they
are
got
our
this
other
pick.
stars from this draft?
I would say the top 10. There were some questionable picks, but there were also a few absolute home runs. Carolina Panthers knocked it out of the park with Christian McCaffrey, the eighth overall pick. Once he came to the league, Panthers still had Jonathan Stewart at that time. It was still pretty productive.
Yeah, he was a good
Getting
back.
older. What's that?
He was a good back, Jonathan Stewart.
Always a great back when they had who's the other one they had? It's like a 1-2. D'Angelo Williams was the other one. They had a pretty
Hmm.
good 1-2 punch for I don't know how many years. McCaffrey is proven to be probably the most versatile back in the league. Just as dangerous through the air as he is on the ground, and even being in San Francisco now, he had a lot of great prime years with the Panthers. Rushed for 1,000 yards in 4 different seasons, and just absolute stud in every sense of the word. Panthers, absolutely hit a home run here, and I mean, be hard pressed to say anything negative about this pick. It's for at eight overall, you can't hope for more than a
Yeah,
star
he was
running back
pretty
like
much
that.
locked into the Panthers heading into that draft. Like on, if you look at like Mel Kiper's board or other pre-draft prediction boards, like everybody thought Jacksonville was going to take Fournette, and then everybody thought that the Panthers were going to take Christian McCaffrey. And he did kind of
Yeah,
do
he was
everything for
more.
Stanford. I mean, he did kick returns and punt returns, and you know, a lot of receiving yards for a running back.
And even with having injury concerns the last like few years, obviously this year back to form, which is awesome to see. Um, but you look at Leonard Fournette, he had a couple years where he was great, and then tailed off, in a big way. Had a little bit of time with the Bucks, but really didn't live up to that draft spot. And McCaffrey, far and away, obviously the best running back in this draft. I don't think it's particularly close. Um, but you really over 7,000 career yards. Just he does everything that you could ask for. Like you mentioned, he did it at Stanford and has still continued to do it at the NFL level. And basically is the 49ers offense this year. If you take him, if he was out again this year, they would be literally atrocious.
Sure.
But
And then obviously there's the big pick at number 10,
yeah,
Patty
Patrick
Mahomes.
Mahomes. I don't think anyone thought that's what the Chiefs were getting when they took him at number 10. Don't want to say necessarily a project pick, but he was not, obviously was not the top quarterback selected in this draft, and has surpassed that in every possible sense. At the time, Kansas City had Alex Smith and was still, in the prime of his career and still playing well. So Mahomes didn't play a ton in 2017, his rookie year, but by 2018, was burst onto the scene, over 5,000 passing yards, 50 touchdowns, and since has done it all. Three Super Bowls, three Super Bowl MVPs. If,
I knew that the Chiefs had traded up for that pick, and I didn't realize until doing a deeper dive. And I think this is um, a really interesting tidbit: is that they got this pick from Buffalo. They traded they traded their first and third that year, which they had a late first as well as a late third, and then they traded a first in 2018 to move up a bunch of. I mean, they moved up 17 spots, but given the rivalry between the Chiefs and the Bills since they got Patrick Mahomes, since the Chiefs got Patrick Mahomes, I think that's just an extra little piece of the story that's so interesting that Buffalo was the one that gave them this pick.
yeah, I think that's definitely forgotten about, and I mean, it's super interesting considering that the battles that Mahomes and Josh Allen have had in recent years. I mean, every game seems to be a classic, especially when it comes to the playoffs. And you know, obviously the Chiefs more often than not have gotten the better of them. So it is interesting, imagining, maybe Mahomes is in Buffalo if they, keep that pick, and who knows what could happen. But it's just super interesting to see that, um, this three-time Super Bowl MVP, you know, wasn't wasn't a player that Kansas City would have gotten otherwise. So I definitely think that's super intriguing.
Yeah, and like you said, Mahomes was. I don't know if he was exactly a project, but I think he was definitely a gunslinger. Like people really thought he had a big arm at Texas Tech. He had some huge games. Like he has some like 700-yard games or 600-yard games.
They had him and Baker Mayfield went toe to toe when Oklahoma and Texas Tech played. I forget what year it was in his career, but like both quarterbacks threw for like over 700 yards, and like it's like a combined like 15 touchdowns, or like you know Madden type stuff, like just absolutely crazy. And you know
I
Mahomes
think
just
people thought that he didn't necessarily because the Texas Tech wasn't that good.
no.
Their record was like 6-7 with them, or like 5-8, or I think they went to a bowl a couple of those years. But he wasn't like powering them into the top 10 of the national rankings or something.
I think it's also interesting because like the Big 12 is notorious for those like kind of spread offenses where they're just, throwing it around the yard and, not a ton of defense is being played. They're always out of the shotgun, always have those four wide receiver sets. And, you know, sometimes you don't know what you're going to get if, a quarterback is playing in an NFL offense. And I think, with if you're throwing 7, 8 touchdowns in a game, like that's absolutely crazy. And is that going to translate to the NFL? Like you just don't always know.
Sure, and there were a lot of other good picks in this first round. I think it was overall a pretty strong first round. Marshawn Lattimore went 11th, who was a really good player. Deshaun Watson, until he derailed his life, was a pretty good
Mm-hmm.
player.
Marlon
Evan
Humphrey's
Ingram
been
and
pretty
Tre'Davious
solid
White and
for.
David Njoku, like those are all good players. And then the Steelers popped T.J. Watt at number 30, which is
Absolute steal at 30th overall. I mean,
yeah. I don't remember at the time, was he injured or something coming into that draft? Like I think there were some
I,
concerns.
I don't remember offhand, but he was. Yeah, I mean, the slide almost out of the first round, and kind of that. I mean, was there a better landing spot than Pittsburgh? Probably not. I mean, that really obviously suits his skill set, and having those huge pass rushers is something Steelers have thrived with over the years. Um, but I just think that when you could secure that type of steal at 30, I mean, I feel like that's insane. You know, I don't remember. I don't
Especially when the
remember
Steelers
seeing.
were already good. Like they were picking towards the end of the draft.
Right, yeah, and same thing. I mean, this draft first round produces two generational pass rushers with him and Garrett. Both in top five among active players in sacks, just absolute studs. A few players get after the quarterback like T.J. Watt, just an absolute strip sack machine, and it's hard to imagine a better fit for the Steelers that they got with this pick.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that struck me. I don't know. This is totally random and totally off base. There are actually 4 players in the first round this year that have food related names. I don't know if you realize that or not. You have
Taco Charlton,
Taco Charlton. You have O.J. Howard.
Jabril
You have
Peppers.
Jabril Peppers and Reuben Foster.
Oh, Reuben Foster. Yeah, who doesn't like a nice Reuben?
I think that's probably an NFL record for food related
No,
names.
that's amazing. I had not thought of that, but that's an amazing tidbit. That's the kind of hard hitting info that the people are here for.
That just jumped off the page to me when
That's hilarious.
I saw Taco Charlton and Reuben Foster like real close to each other. And so then I went through the rest of the list. And I'm like, wow, there's a lot of food related names here. Any other big stars you want to talk about from this draft?
Um, Not particularly. Obviously, later in the draft, you never know what you're going to hit. Alvin Kamara ends up going to the Saints at pick 67 in the third round. A pretty great career, and played all with the Saints, and is obviously one of the top running backs that came out of this class. Um, you we definitely have some underrated guys. George Kittle being a fifth round pick, I think, is maybe the most interesting.
Yeah,
The
that's
Iowa
probably the
type.
pick of the draft, honestly. I mean, we'll talk about him more when we
Yeah,
talk about sort of underrated players later, but he's
yeah.
probably a
There's
Hall of Famer.
I think as far as the first round goes, I think those four guys that we mentioned are definitely the cream of the crop. There was some like we said, some other guys that were productive and have had good careers, but no one kind of on that Mahomes and Garrett and all those guys on that same level.
Sure. Well, who are the busts then? Because there were some real busts in this first round as well.
There was a couple bad ones. I mean, after Garrett goes, I think Mitch Trubisky at 2, considering that the Bears traded up one spot. I don't remember who San Francisco had at quarterback. Like, were they going to take a quarterback? I don't
No,
think
they were not going to take a quarterback.
so. Like, why did you feel the need to? They gave up.
They had Colin Kaepernick as quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, still fine at that point, and they gave up their first, their third, their fourth, and a third the following year, just to move up one spot. With a team that wasn't going to take Mitch Trubisky, and you know, Trubisky wasn't terrible. I mean, we're not talking about like a Ryan Leaf, Jamarcus Russell, absolute train wreck of a bust, but you know,
He's still in
did
the
live
league.
up to what the draft position was. I think, it's
I think the
fine. I
Bears caught
mean,
a lot of heat for giving up that much capital to move
yeah, I think if they don't
a
trade up, I don't think they would have. I don't think it would be considered as egregious. I mean, still, obviously, wasn't a great pick, but yeah, I agree. I don't think they would have caught as much flack for that if they weren't giving up, four picks or whatever it was. Um, for a guy that didn't have a ton of experience, he only had 13 career starts at North Carolina before he was drafted. Like, it just, I don't know. I feel like
Yeah,
it
he
wasn't a
sat
huge
behind
surprise.
another play. I always think it's interesting when players have to sit
Mm-hmm.
behind relatively low level quarterbacks.
Yeah, I think it's very. I mean, it's definitely really telling. I mean, if you're that good, you're obviously gonna pop off at some point, and that just never really happened for him. Until late in his career, and it's not like they had anyone great. Like Marquise Williams was their quarterback in 2015.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, like not not even like name sounds maybe vaguely familiar, but like I don't he was a multi-year starter. And so I guess they're just kind of rolling with what was comfortable. And then once Trubisky takes over, like did fine and obviously did enough to get himself drafted in the top three, which is impressive. But you know had the time with the Bears and was quarterback a little bit for the Steelers and has had two stints with the Bills, but nothing never was like earth shattering by any means. Just the epitome of like a veteran, average backup.
Yeah, he's a decent backup. Um, had some decent games with a few of those teams. Wonder if we'll see
Mm-hmm.
that as a trend as we go through more of these drafts that quarterbacks that kind of jump off the page with one great year, if they
Right.
end up being terrible, as opposed to Patrick Mahomes was a 3-year starter at Texas Tech. Deshaun Watson was a multi-year starter at Clemson, won a national championship.
But
Uh,
then you have guys like when Cam Newton at Auburn like one big year and
True.
enough to get drafted high and and obviously had ended up having a pretty good career. Was certainly not a bust by any means, and I think it's definitely something that I'll interested to learn as we go through more of these over the years.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other big set of busts to talk about are these wide receivers that were taken at the top of this first round,
Absolutely.
and there were three. I mean, they had them in different orders depending on who you looked at the time in terms of like draft rankings. I think the consensus best wide receiver was Mike Williams, um, coming out of Clemson. I think, but he was selected seventh by the Chargers. Corey Davis was selected fifth by the Titans, and John Ross was selected by the Cincinnati Bengals at number 9. And those picks were all made at the time. Like nobody jumped up to get those picks. The Titans pick was
No.
a trade, but it was a pre-draft trade. So what's the deal with these three wide receivers?
Yeah, I mean, definitely was one of the more lackluster wide receiver classes that we've seen. Um, Corey Davis at 5, did he have the career that obviously the Titans would have hoped for? No. But at the same time, I don't think it's not an all time bust territory. Like he, never had 1,000 yard seasons, but he had over 800 yards twice in his 7 seasons, which not amazing by any stretch, but also not bordering on like you know John Ross territory, for example. He had the fastest 40 time at the combine that year, running a 4.22. which was a record at that time until Xavier Worthy broke it a couple
Sure.
years later. But his entire career, he didn't even have 1,000 yards,
No,
963 yards, 63 catches, and 11 touchdowns. Like never more than 500 yards in a season. They get like 506 or whatever it was the one year, but like just did not jump off the page at all. He
the
was
speed
kind of
didn't translate. And I think if historically, if you
not at
look at those
all.
speed guys like Darius Hayward Bay and those other like speed guys that get picked at the top of the first round, like they almost never pan out.
No, it is an interesting trend that the speed, like if that's all they bring to the table, not necessarily a guy on the doesn't have necessarily a bigger frame, doesn't seem to do as well. Like there was all those years that, like you mentioned, Hayward Bay, Al Davis would just take whoever the fastest 40 time was at wide receiver and say, hey, like he's going to translate and be a stud. Where,
Yeah.
you know, Darius
And
Hayward
Mike
Bay had a
Williams had
fine
an okay
career.
career. Like he was the third
Yeah,
one. He
he
had an
was
okay
fine.
career, but not deserving of the number 7 pick.
Absolutely not. No. I mean,
He had 1,000 yards once, I think.
yeah, it was solid for them. And even, in his later years as kind of a secondary receiver, spent some time with the Steelers and was fine, but definitely more productive than Ross was. He just absolute. I think I'd view Ross as kind of he is the true bust of this wide receiver group. I think Corey Davis, like I said, was at least produced some solid campaigns. Ross never gave Cincinnati or the Jets or Giants rather. And then I think he had a cup of coffee with the Eagles last year. I think was with them in camp, but didn't really play very much. But I think that Ross is by far the most egregious pick out of this group. I think at least, obviously Mike Williams was who he just retired, I believe, last year, right? I think if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Um,
And people hated the John Ross pick after it was made as well. Corey Davis going fifth. It's I believe the highest. And it wasn't the highest MAC player ever taken. He went to Western Michigan. It's interesting he
yeah,
didn't go to a power conference. Wonder if we'll see that as kind of a trend, like the bust skill players that I mean he had these eye-popping numbers at Western Michigan, right? He had like, these 1,400, 1,500 yard years because he was playing against guys that were probably walk-ons or 3-star recruits or something. I wonder if we'll see that going forward, that the busts tend to come from these small schools that make it all the way up to the top of the
yeah. I mean,
draft.
it's definitely interesting. I think you don't know if the talent's going to always translate. Like Carson Wentz goes to North Dakota State and does have some success with the Eagles, and obviously is still hanging around in the league, so he's got to be doing something right. Over the long haul, maybe wasn't the kind of superstar that they thought, but Josh Allen goes to Wyoming. All these smaller schools, you know, it is hit or miss, I guess, when you don't really know what you're going to get when they're playing against kind of inferior competition.
Yeah,
But
I suspect that going forward, I mean, this is back in 2017 when the transfer rules were still harsh.
yeah,
If you were in college and you wanted to transfer back then, you had to sit out a year typically, unless there was some intervening event that
yeah, like a
allowed you to play
hardship
the next
or
year, like a coaching change or something. You had to sit out a full year
right.
if you wanted to transfer. And so nobody transferred, or hardly anybody ever transferred. Now it's like free agency. And so
Exactly, it's the wild. It's absolutely the Wild West. Like
if you go
whoever's
to
got
Western
the
Michigan and you put up 1,500 yards, like you're going to transfer to a big
yeah,
power
you're going to
conference
go to
school.
Ohio State or USC or some kind of big time program. That's yeah,
Yeah, so I
there's
suspect that that's not going to happen going forward. You'd have to be some
especially
like
the last
crazy
couple of years.
loyal athlete that really, really wanted to play at Western Michigan or Boise or whatever. Like with Ashton Genty at Boise, like he could have transferred somewhere else, and chose not to. Another bust I would just highlight in this first round. It's a little bit later in the first round. It's the number 19 pick, OJ Howard. He if you look back at his numbers, he did not have exactly eye-popping numbers at Alabama when he was playing there, and Bucks were picking at that pick, which they were the number 19 pick, which means they had a good team, but not a great team. They really needed to move forward, like taking a tight end there. He was supposed to be, like a monster. He had, he was 250 pounds but ran like a 4.5 at the combine. He won a ring with the Bucks actually when Tom Brady was there. But just he did his 4 years at the Bucks. Maybe his fifth year option was picked up. I'm not sure. And he just kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. And I feel like that's probably a bust from a mid first round pick.
Yeah, I think he was one that elevated his stock based on both of those years, 2016 and the 2017 national championship. Like he had big time performances on in both of those spots, and I think anytime you're going to thrive like that on the big stage, like they played Clemson in both of those years. So obviously, at that time, that was a big time matchup between those two schools, and um, you know, 2016 national championship, he had 5 catches for 208 yards and 2 touchdowns. I mean, that's pretty convincing. And then the following year, 4 for 106 and a touchdown. So dominating on that big stage. I mean, not that you're basing it off of 2 games, but if you're going to thrive against the best competition that the college world has to offer, I think that's going to count for something, and probably did help boost his draft stock a lot. And he was kind of described as being this uber athletic, tight end, and he was fine, but just nothing. It didn't translate. I don't think the way that anybody thought it would. Like, only had more than 500 yards in one season. Like, you know, had a handful of touchdowns, but nothing. That really moved the needle. And then, like you said, just literally fell off the face of the earth, and was out of the league by 2022. So I think even though he wasn't super high, it's definitely in the bust territory.
Yeah, I mean, he had kind of the frame and measurables of like Brock Bowers, but just I don't know if his hands just weren't as good or he wasn't as crisp of a route runner because he's humongous and fast. So just it didn't translate. What were some underrated players in this draft? If you look kind of later down into the rounds, who do you like?
I would say, like I mentioned, Kamara is a good one. Going in the third round out of Tennessee is, obviously carved up a great career. Um, One of the most intriguing, I think, is ironically 2 picks later, at 69th overall, the Rams grabbed Cooper Kupp out of Eastern Washington, who I don't think anybody really knows anything about Eastern Washington, or
Not me.
expected them to you know churn out this great wide receiver who maybe is fallen off a little bit in terms of injuries the last few years, but I mean, in terms of a just reception machine, Cooper Kupp has been the definition of consistency when he was with the Rams, and obviously now with the Seahawks, not off to as hot of a start, especially with JSN thriving there. But I think got to almost think that Cooper Kupp's probably one of the steals of this draft.
Yeah, I mean, he was on pace to be a Hall of Famer. I don't think he's going to get there now, but still a
Yeah.
very good wide receiver. And if you look just a little bit later into the third round, Trey Hendrickson was picked at 103 by the
Yep.
Saints. And he was kind of under the radar for the first couple of years in the league. I don't know if the Saints just didn't run a scheme that worked well for him. Then in his fourth year, because obviously he's a third round pick, so no fifth year option. In that fourth year, he just exploded, and then signed with the Bengals, and has been one of the best defensive linemen or linebackers in the league since.
Yeah, that's definitely he's definitely thrived. I think certainly more since he's gotten to Cincinnati. Led the league in sacks, I believe. I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but
Famously
has
held out before this season because he wanted
right. Yeah, wanted the
more
big
money.
contract.
The
Um,
Bengals are notoriously cheap.
yes, we saw that quite a bit with him and the who was that? The first round pick that they had last year, Shamar Stewart, was into the past training camp and like almost to the regular season before they finally came to terms on a deal. Um, but I think past Hendrickson, Steelers took James Conner at pick 105, a
Good
pretty,
pick.
ended up being a great pick for them. The year Le'Veon Bell ended up holding out, James Conner, kind of took the reins and was able to, kind of burst onto the scene there. Since has ended up with the Cardinals and still continues to be productive, not, earth shattering athleticism or anything like that, but just a solid back that, is great to have on your team. And, all the things that he's overcome, having cancer in college when he was at Pitt, and to have this impressive career. I think that definitely one of the biggest values and one of the more underrated players of this draft.
Yeah, and we talked about George Kittle earlier, who was probably the number one steal of this draft. Getting a likely Hall of Famer in the fifth round is kind of unheard of. The Bengals drafted your boy Jake Elliott, who's been a great kicker
Ah, yes.
for the Eagles for a long time. What are your thoughts? If you're a fan of the Bengals, do you like them using a draft pick for a kicker?
I feel like you have to know that the kicker is just like he's going to pop and he's going to be great because, you have, what was that old? I think it was the one year the Bucks used I say it was a second round pick on a kicker. Yeah, it was like, and it was a second or a third rounder. I mean, I know like Sebastian Janikowski back in the day went in the first round, which obviously is, completely unheard of. But, you get like one or two kickers drafted a year. So usually it's hard to prioritize a kicker because if you have a guy like Elliott, who was, later in the draft and didn't even end up sticking with the Bengals, ends up, having a great career with the Eagles. And you kind of see that all the time where guys are undrafted and just get, maybe they bounce around to a couple teams and then, kind of find their niche, find, where they're most comfortable and, have a solid career. So I feel like it's definitely not a position you need to draft, especially not in like the top 4 or 5 rounds.
Yeah, it was in 2016. I'm sure we'll talk about it when we do that draft. Yeah, the Bucks used a second round pick on Roberto Aguayo, excuse me, who was probably off the team 2 or 3 years later. The Niners used a third round pick on Jake Moody in 2023, who's been a good kicker, but like for your third round pick,
You have to
you
be,
really you really needed a starter with a third round
yeah,
pick.
you have to be extremely consistent and, just super productive. And I think it's rare that you see that for these kickers that are drafted, especially that high. Like you're going to take somebody in the first 3 rounds. That can't be a miss because the amount of guys that you're passing on to take a kicker is pretty long.
And obviously, you go way back. The Raiders used a first round pick on Sebastian Janikowski. Seabass was a great kicker, but that was the number 17 pick in the draft.
Yeah, that's I just can't even imagine that many teams would pull the trigger on a kicker in the first round. That's just seems like not the greatest use of draft capital.
And a few years later, the Jets picked Mike Nugent in the second round.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he was great at Ohio State.
And
Unsurprisingly,
was a good kicker in the NFL, but again,
just
just
not
wait.
worth that investment. I feel like more
No,
often than not. And then the only other one I have, I think, would be Aaron Jones going to the Packers at pick 182. Obviously, striking gold there until recently was with the Packers playing for the Minnesota Vikings now. And I don't, there probably hasn't been a ton of skill position players that have popped from UTEP, but he, had a fantastic career. I mean, not a Hall of Famer or anything, but it's been, one of the league's better backs the last, I don't know how many years. And, you know, still even, as he increases in age, he's still been super productive. So I feel like getting that in the fifth round, I believe it was, you can't beat that production.
sure. There were a handful of UDFA's that made teams. I think the most notable is Austin Eckler
Yep.
out of Western State, which is honestly, when I saw that as a school I've never heard of before.
I was gonna say I have no idea where Western
I
State
couldn't
is
even
like.
tell you what state that's in. Kendrick Bourne is still in the league, playing
Uh-huh.
decently well. Taysom Hill is still in the league, is kind of one of the more interesting players in the league. And Patrick Ricard was a UDFA in that draft, who's been a really
Great
nice
fullback.
fullback, which that position doesn't really exist anymore. But all of those guys went to small schools: Eastern Washington, Western State, BYU, and Maine. And so
Yeah, I don't.
I think that's probably going to be a trend as well. If you're a UDFA and you went to Alabama or something, you're probably not going to be a very good player.
No, exactly. You're on
The
that
good
stage.
UDFAs are going to be from these small schools where,
Absolutely.
I mean, who's scouting Western State? And then
Right.
Eckler's peak was best running back in the league.
Yeah, he was. I mean, maybe 2, 3 years ago, whatever it was, he was up there with like the top like fantasy running backs. He was a guy that everybody always wanted every year for several years in a row, and I think obviously those days are far. I mean, probably not ever going to be the same after his devastating injury this year with Washington,
Yeah.
but still, you know, he's had a great career. I mean, to go from UDFA to obviously cashing in on a decent contract and sticking with the Chargers for as long as he did is pretty impressive. Um, the only other one I had on my list, and this is selfishly as an Eagles fan, was Corey Clement was not a bad pickup. He was a UDFA out of Wisconsin, running back, kind of a receiving running back, and did end up catching a touchdown in the Super Bowl,
Oh,
Super
nice.
Bowl 52. Um, you know, ironically, one of the bigger, going to Wisconsin, obviously no small school, those, so that he was able to stick a little more than obviously, like we said, some of these other guys are Western, Eastern Washington, Maine. You're not very many guys coming out of those schools, but Clement had a couple decent years with the Eagles, and then kind of faded into obscurity. But when you look at the list of the UDFA's that year, there's not very many that stuck at all or that you really have heard of. So to get a moment like that on a big stage is pretty cool for a guy like that.
Um, I think it's worth noting because one of the sort of underrated players, and we didn't really talk about him, and I don't know that we need to go into a lot of depth on him. Alex Anzalone was drafted by the Saints in the third round and was kind of unremarkable with the Saints, and then got pretty good with the Lions, and he's the starting linebacker now for the Lions, which got me down the rabbit hole. I think it's worth giving the Saints their props on this. I don't know if you looked at the draft card of the Saints, but this might be the greatest draft class in history. We'll see. They had 7 picks in that draft, and they drafted Marshawn Lattimore in the first round, who was the following year's
Great pick.
defensive rookie of the year. Great pick. Ryan Ramczyk at the end of that first round, it was started at tackle for them for 8 years or something, and I think he tore his Achilles at the end of that 8th year and was never really the same again, but was a really productive offensive tackle for them. They picked Marcus Williams in the second round, who was a
Yeah,
free safety out of Utah. Really strong player, played a lot of years. His second contract, he signed like a $70 million contract with his second contract. And again, I think he got injured towards the end of that contract and didn't do too well. They had 3 third-round picks: Alvin Kamara, Alex Anzalone, and Trey Hendrickson. Which, I mean, those are 3 home
you
run
can't.
picks in the
I
third
mean,
round.
yeah, 3 star players like have you can't have a more perfect round than that.
Right. And then they picked Al Qadin Muhammad in the 6th round. They didn't have a 4th, 5th, or 7th that year. But he played for them for a while, but now is the starting defensive end for the Lions opposite Aiden
Aiden
Hutchinson.
Hutchinson, yeah, that's
And
true.
so I think it's interesting to note, 2 of those guys now play on Detroit's defense. Sean Payton was the head coach of the Saints that year, but you know who the assistant head coach was of that team? It was Dan Campbell,
Oh,
and
that's right. Yeah,
and the secondary coach on that team was Aaron Glenn. And so those guys saw those players. First of all, clearly have an eye for talent because the Lions are one of the. We'll get to this when we talk
Absolutely
about like the
loaded. Yeah, no doubt about
2023 and 2024 draft classes. Like they're one of the best drafting front offices that there
it.
is.
Without a doubt.
But Dan and Aaron clearly saw these guys playing, and Dan is, I think, more of an offensive coach than he is a defensive coach. But he's the coach of the tight ends on that team and was the assistant head coach and calls the plays for the Lions now. But they clearly saw what they liked out of those players, and either the Saints just weren't getting everything out of them that they could, or what have you. But they clearly knew there was a scheme that would fit with those players, and now, I mean, Al-Quadin Muhammad has like 6 sacks and gets tons of great looks because he's playing opposite of maybe the best defensive end in the league. So two pieces of that defense came from that insane Saints draft class, which again no Hall of Famers there. Well, maybe Trey Hendrickson has a chance if he continues to put up 15 sacks a year.
But still, to get that type of production from that
To hit
many
on all
different
7 of their picks, I thought
yeah,
was remarkable. I think the Steelers also had a pretty good draft that year. They picked Watt, obviously, who we've talked about already, and Juju Smith-Schuster, and James Conner and Josh Dobbs. Like that's 4 very productive players.
no, that's true. I definitely didn't dive that deep into the Saints, and that's I mean that third
I
round
just got there
alone.
because I saw Anzalone and he got picked up later, and so I was like diving deeper into his career, and then that got me to the draft class of the Saints, which it was just remarkable that they were able to make that many great picks. I think that's what's interesting about the draft. Like everybody has the same information, but clearly some teams are just better, and sometimes it's position specific. Like they're great at drafting quarterbacks or drafting running backs or whatever. Like
Teams are just yeah, some are just better at developing certain positions for whatever reason, and some teams shy away from certain ones. Like was the running joke until this year that the Green Bay Packers never took a wide receiver in the first round until they took Matthew Golden this year. Like it just certain teams that don't draft certain positions well or don't develop talent well, and some that do. So I think as we go more into this, that's going to be interesting to see kind of, if there's players that, were drafted by a certain team in the first round, maybe didn't have that success there, but go somewhere else and, kind of figure it out and, go on to have a good career. I think that'll be pretty intriguing to see.
yeah. All right, so let's wrap it up here. What do you think of what would you say all overall from the 2017 NFL draft? Was it a decent one, a bad one, a great one? Obviously, it has some high end talent.
I would say I don't know if I'd say it was an all-time draft, but it's definitely up there, definitely above average. I mean, the number one pick was hit on. You got 3, perennial superstar, tops at their position, arguably, in Mahomes, McCaffrey, and Garrett. You know, aside from Trubisky and maybe Solomon Thomas at number 2, and well, John Ross as well, the majority of the top 10 was pretty solid, even besides Garrett, McCaffrey, and Mahomes. And then throughout the first round, you had a decent guys that are still hanging around in the league. Evan Ingram, Jabril Peppers, Marlon Humphrey, Adoree Jackson, like productive players. I do think certainly were a lot of misses, and that's always going to happen. But I would say this was probably an above average draft. Maybe not an all timer, but when you have a guy like Pat Mahomes going with that kind of a value and, those 3 guys in the top 10, it's, going to elevate any draft. And I think this was a good one for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably 5 Hall of Famers in this draft at least, with Mahomes, McCaffrey, Garrett, Watt, and Kittle. And
Yep.
I think Trey Hendrickson has an outside chance of getting there. It's
Yeah, I mean,
hard to get in
depending
at the
on
defensive end,
what
but
happened.
the sack totals have been so inflated. Um, it's kind of hard to get in there just on the stats alone. But anytime you have 5 Hall of Famers in a draft, it's got to be a good one. What are
absolutely.
your thoughts on Mahomes? If he had been drafted by a different team, would he have still turned out to be as good?
That's interesting. I mean, I feel like that's always an interesting game to play if you look at teams around that. If you know um, around where the Chiefs were picking, since they did trade up for him, you know, does he have the kind of same success? Like, do the Texans take him instead of taking Deshaun Watson? That's interesting to think about. You know, I think the talent of Mahomes probably would have excelled anywhere. But you also, got him under the tutelage of Andy Reid, who is an offensive guru and has been for decades. I think that certainly helped him a lot. So I think he still would be. I don't know if he'd be as elite as he is, but I do think Mahomes still would have been a above average quarterback, even if he would have landed, somewhere maybe not as exciting as the Chiefs that kind of ended up having these great offenses, and he was under a good coaching staff.
Yeah, and I think his elite skill is his decision making. I don't think it's. I mean, he's a good running quarterback. Like he can run. He's actually running more this year than he has any of his previous years. I think. Um, he's got a good arm, but not like he's not a guy like Jamarcus Russell who can throw it 80 yards from his knees or something.
No,
Like he's got a very good arm. Um, I think his decision making speed and skill is what makes him elite. And so I think that probably would translate anywhere else. He's not in a system that's focused on just harnessing his running skill or something like a Michael Vick kind of player that where you design the whole system around his ability to run. And if you don't have that kind of offensive line that can pull and run, like then it just doesn't translate. I think he definitely would have translated somewhere else.
yeah, I don't know if it would be at that level that he's at now, but I think we've seen over the years the Chiefs, you know, like to use he uses those shovel passes around the goal line. Has made a name for himself doing that. He said that the quick decision making is definitely what makes him elite as far as what he's able to do. And I just think that once, being in a system like that, it certainly did him a lot of favors. And, if he lands with the Jets or something like that, like, is he going to be as elite? Like, probably not because the talent is not there. And, you know, the amount of times, teams like that have missed on picks to kind of surround him with talent maybe wouldn't have, afforded him the opportunities that he's had. But he's just incredible to watch, and definitely got to be the star of this draft. Probably him or Garrett. Probably one. Any of the three really. You can't go wrong. I mean, three Hall of Famers already. I think you can't really dispute that. So
All right, so Chris, why don't you preview for us what's coming up on the next episode?
yeah, so we're gonna, like we said, you know try to bounce back and forth between the NFL and NBA, since we both do find both sports very interesting in the draft realm. I think you know our knowledge probably is kind of capped in that like mid to late 80s. Obviously, I'm sure we'll get to the Michael Jordan draft at some point because we have to. But next week, we're going to dive into the 2003 NBA draft, which obviously was, LeBron James going first overall. Spoiler alert. But there was a lot of talent in that. Top five, one very intriguing bust. Um, and overall, I think that'll be a very fun one to get into. As there definitely were a good amount of busts, but some very high end, all time talent. So we'll dive into the 2003 one next week, and that'll be our first NBA episode.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that time. I would have been just graduating college around then, and the buzz around LeBron was unlike any I had seen before a draft. Certainly.
Yeah, never. absolutely. I mean, his games were on his high school games being on ESPN and all that were, you know, something that was never seen before. And I think there's so much talent there, and that's going to be a fun one to get into. I can't wait to dive into that one.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening to our first episode, episodes 1. Obviously, we did episode 0 as just a small little teaser. If for some reason one of the dozens of people that will ultimately listen to this wants to contact the show, you can email us at podcast@backdraftpodcast.com. Chris, where can they reach us on socials?
We Yep, we also have a Twitter account for the podcast. It's just at Backdraft Pod. You can shoot us a DM, shoot us a mention, and anything like you want us to talk about from a particular draft that we're doing coming up, or just any, want to get your thoughts on, what we thought of said draft that we just dissected. You can reach us over there or email us.
And wherever you consume your podcast, please give us a like, a subscribe.
Five stars, please.
5 stars, please. We don't have any sponsors. I'm sure they're going to start knocking down the door after this first episode.
I think I hear them. I can see it in the distance for sure.
Okay. Well, until next time, Chris, any parting words?
No, just excited to get into this and keep alternating between these drafts, and it's going to be an absolute blast to pull up a chair and break down some of these ridiculous picks.
All right. Until next time, everybody.
See ya.
See ya.